The Lost Villages of Saint-Hilaire. Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois was one of those sleepy villages in the Artois region that had hardly changed for generations. In 1900, modern life had largely passed it by. The nearest railway station was more than 10 kilometres away. None of its roads were paved. Indeed, most were little more than tracks. But these were entirely appropriate to their traffic of horses and oxen-driven farm wagons. Nestled among the trees was the church of Saint-Hilaire, its stumpy square tower just visible among the trees from beyond the village. This ancient house of worship was named for a 4th century bishop of Poitiers. Just beyond the church, on the cobbled lane that connected Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois with its sister community of Saint-Hilaire-le-Grand, was the Manoir Saint-Hilaire, which had been the former house of the Comte Saint-Hilaire. This house of minor nobility had lost its title at the time of the Revolution, simultaneously with the severing of the head of the last count. Here lived the last two surviving members of the Saint-Hilaire dynasty, elderly sisters Antoinette and Lucille, great-grandchildren of the last count. The bureaucratic life of the French Third Republic made its presence felt only through the mairie and the bureau de poste, whose offices were situated, along with an épicerie and a boulangerie, just off the diminutive but obligatory Place de la République. The remainder of the commercial centre, such as it was, comprised two tiny bars on the Place de la République and a tobacco on the cobblestone Rue Victor Hugo, shaded with plane trees like the square. Meats and delicatessen were available some 2 kilometres distant at Saint-Hilaire-le-Grand. This had at one time been a larger community, but in 1900 was equally small and equally somnolent as its sister. Between them, the two villages numbered fewer than 400 souls. The outmoded community of Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois largely escaped the vigorous laïcité promoted by the law of 1905, which had made secularism the new religion of France. However, most villagers still dutifully attended Mass, presided over each week by the elderly curé Père François, whose limited ability as a preacher was compensated by the brevity of his homilies. The one-room village school, under the supervision of one Madame de Vaux, even displayed the crucifix on the front wall of the classroom, although it was discreetly removed for the annual visit of the government school inspector from the county seat of Hilaire and then reinstated. The gentle depression which ran alongside the cemetery was the watercourse of the Ruisseau du Moulin. This lazy brook emerged from underground a couple of kilometres upstream from the village, providing an ever-flowing source of cool water, even in the driest summers. The mill was still used for grinding the grain harvest, as had been the custom since before anyone could remember. And the stream had been dammed at some time in the distant, unremembered past to create a small lake bordered by willow trees. Among the trees and beside the lake ran pleasant pathways that were used by elderly villagers taking Sunday afternoon strolls and courting couples by evening. Down the generations, many villages had been conceived in this cool grass, away from the midges that frequented the environs of the stream itself. These acts of fecundity constituted a way station on the trajectory of life that comprised conception, marriage and birth, often in that order. Typically the curé, while outwardly deploring these manifestations of the sinful nature of his flock, accepted them as typical of fallen humanity, and exacted penance only in the form of a few dozen Hail Marys. Depending on one's point of view, the community of Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois could be considered either poor or not poor. Certainly, had a Parisian chosen to visit, which no one could ever remember happening, he would have been scandalised by the lack of culture and of modern convenience. No gas lights illuminated the nighttime square. Only oil lamps burned in the windows at eventide, and telephone service had not yet arrived in the community. The inhabitants he would most certainly have described as peasants, paysans, and in disparaging terms rather than merely describing people of the land. The people of Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois dressed in rustic fashion, the men with canvas trousers and leather jerkins, the women in long black dresses and old-style bonnets. All wore boots or sometimes wooden clogs. A rural dialect would have been almost impossible for our imaginary Parisian to comprehend. Yet at the same time, the village was rich in community. People harvested together, working in teams that travelled from farmstead to farmstead, reaping and threshing. They helped one another out in times of difficulty or disaster, such as when a barn burned down or accident or disease left a family orphaned. Indeed, every member of the community was connected by blood through multiple generations. Many still spoke of the widow Lavoie as from away, even though this ancient had come to the village from Arras as a young bride 60 years earlier. Life in Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois revolved around an unvarying seasonal calendar, planting, tending, harvesting and conserving for the winter months, until the cycle of the seasons would begin again. Into this seemingly tranquil existence, the events of August 1914 forcefully thrust themselves. It must be admitted that until that time, the people of Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois had taken little interest or even knew little about the happenings of the wider European world. And as for an assassinated Austro-Hungarian Archduke Ferdinand, the limited education of the typical villager made it highly unlikely that he or she could have located the Archduke's homeland on a map. In sun-drenched early August, matters of greater moment were reaping and threshing the wheat and barley harvests by the menfolks. The womenfolk, meanwhile, provided food for the parties of the hungry, making their way from field to field, farm to farm, as well as carrying water from wells to ensure the survival of thirsty vegetables. But with or without foresight, it was into the resulting maelstrom that the visitors were now swept. On August 1st, 1914, no official notice was posted on the board outside the mairie. It announced that a state of war now existed between France and the feared and hated Boche, whose triumph over their homeland some 40 years earlier had been the source of national humiliation. All military personnel, both regulars and reservists, were to report forthwith to their regiments. The announcement elicited a degree of enthusiasm, at least among the young men, at the prospect of reversing this national shame, so that le jour de gloire might indeed be arrivé this time. It left only the older men plus the women and children to complete the harvest. The war began badly for France. Immediately upon commencement of hostilities, neutral Belgium was overrun, bringing the war into Flanders. A series of mobile battles, perhaps the last ever to involve cavalry, saw back and forth gains and losses through southern Belgium and Flanders, with terrible casualties on both sides. Within the month of August, occasional explosions of artillery shells could be heard to the north and east, with occasional plumes of black smoke smudging the distant horizon. Bad news followed quickly. Even though some of the young men of the two Saint-Hilaire villages went to war with a sense of excitement and adventure, memories of 1817 filled the older villagers back home with dread. And dread was not long in becoming reality. Within a month, the first casualty was recorded among the soldiers from Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois. At this early stage of the war, his body was returned home for funeral obsequies and burial. Père François did his best to find words of comfort and of meaning to the grieving family, whose son had perished for la gloire de la patrie. But the reality was that hard times were ahead. Unimaginably worse followed. By late 1914, the mobile skirmishes had fought themselves to a stalemate, with the opposing armies deployed along a line that passed through Flanders and Artois from Switzerland to the sea. Now the two sides became entrenched. Heavy artillery were brought up close to the front lines. In towns and villages across the region, orders came to evacuate without delay. Any villagers inclined to disobey or to procrastinate quickly changed their minds when the first artillery shell to strike Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois landed in the cemetery. This blew out all the church windows and threw up the bones of loved ones and ancestors far and wide, leaving a crater over 2 meters in depth. The only holdouts for evacuation were the elderly Antoinette, Lucille, and their faithful retainer Lise Marie. former refused to move since it would have demeaned their status in the community to be seen trundling out of the village with their belongings on display. The latter stayed out of loyalty. As a concession to the approaching war zone, the two ladies consented to move into the basement of the manoir, sending Lise Marie up to cook their meals. Within days, however, intense shelling of the manor house reduced both the building and its 3 inhabitants to unidentifiable debris. To some extent, the ironical situation existed that in the evacuation which followed, those with the greater material possessions were worse off than those without. Those with nothing took to the lanes leading south and west with scarcely more than the clothes on their backs, with such provisions as they could carry, and the savings, if any, that they had retrieved from under their mattresses. The wealthier peasants, those who owned horses or oxen, piled their belongings high onto carts and wagons, before they lumbered out of town somewhat later. On the road, their personal effects were a severe encumbrance. Army units, both cavalry and infantry, were hurrying in the opposite direction. The unencumbered peasants stood aside, but not those with carts or wagons. The army officers had no patience with ox carts obstructing their progress to the battle front. Time and again their owners were cursed volubly and obscenely, and their wagons were forced into fields while they waited interminably for the military units to pass. In the end, most gave up the struggle, took what they could carry, abandoned their once prized possessions and continued on foot. The oldest and weakest fell by the wayside, and no one was left to care for them. Photographic images from military conflicts have accustomed non-combatants to the sight of lines of fleeing refugees from a war zone. But where do they go, and what do they do when they get there? This was the quandary facing the villagers from Saint-Hilaire. It was clear that they should put as much distance as possible between themselves and their former homes. They found themselves in strange villages and towns all alone, separated from kinfolk, knowing no one. The men who were not too old found work in their former occupations as farm labourers. Others filled factory positions that had become vacant when their holders were conscripted into the army. For the women folk, options were more limited, especially for those accompanied by children. There were farm labouring and factory jobs for the physically strong, as well as some positions in domestic service. Tragically, however, some of the villagers were reduced to begging or to selling their bodies in far-off townships to acquire the most meagre necessities of life. Meanwhile, the two Saint-Hilaire villages were fought over and fought over again, until nothing recognisable remained of the pretty communities that once existed. Not one wall of a single building remained standing. There survived not a single shattered stump of the trees from which the Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois had taken its name. There were only barbed wire, shell holes and broken bodies in the zone called No Man's Land that separated the opposing lines of trenches dug deep into the ground. Life for the soldiers in the trenches around Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois was even more miserable than those of the displaced villagers. Any soldier foolhardy enough to strike a match, to light a cigarette in the darkness, or to look over the rim of his trench, faced the likelihood of having his head shot off by sniper fire. It was not enough to eat. There were constant assaults on the senses, on the ears from the shelling, on the nostrils from the stench of unrecovered corpses and body parts. Foot rot, lice and diarrhea were ubiquitous. But worst of all were the inexplicable orders from faraway generals to charge the opposing lines in the vain hope of gaining a few hundred metres of terrain, in reality to be mown down by enemy machine gun fire while achieving no tangible result. When at last, in November 1918, the hostilities ended after 4 appalling years, reconstruction began across shattered northeastern France. But in Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois there was nothing to rebuild. So completely had 4 years of trench warfare obliterated what there once had been, that the very topography had given place to a desolate and limitless late autumn muddiness. Where once the village had been located, the former Ruisseau du Moulin contributed its waters to a pervasive sea of mud. Water-filled shell hole craters and barbed wire that spread out in every direction. As for the former inhabitants, they were either dispersed or deceased. All records pertaining to the settlement, civil or ecclesiastical, had been lost in the total destruction of church and mairie. There was nothing to rebuild and no one to inform that they could return, even if reconstruction could have been attempted. When much later some of the former inhabitants did go back to the site of their ancestral village, there was nothing to see, and they returned whence they'd come, wishing they'd never made the pilgrimage. After 1918, memorials to those morts pour la France began to be erected across the nation. But no monument stands to commemorate the people of Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois. Their memory is as long forgotten as those of the fields where once they worked, the homes where once they lived, and the woodland glades where once they had expressed their love for one another. Only occasional broken human remains and rusted and unexploded ordnance, unearthed when the rolling fields are ploughed in the springtime, bear mute testimony to the time when everything changed. Today there's neither a physical reminder nor a memory that the two Saint-Hilaire villages ever existed. 100 years on, there is no one left who was born there or lived there to tell stories about themselves or of the location. Even the landscape forgot its natural contours over the course of its 4-year ravishment. The attractive settlements with their winding narrow lanes, patchwork fields and labourers' cottages have given way to a terrain of rolling fields, hundreds of hectares in size, whose gentle contours serve the convenience of the equipment that now sows, sprays and harvests the grain mechanically. The Ruisseau du Moulin is no more, though a culvert passes under the paved road that now leads to Arras, part of a drainage ditch that removes the runoff from the tiled fields, somewhere close to where the former village of Saint-Hilaire-en-Bois once stood.